All right, so I want to welcome you to session 2 of the virtual confirmation retreat. Again, my name is Brian Wallace, and it is good to be with you in not a physical way, but in a virtual way. Wanted to kind of dive ahead in session 1. We talked a little bit about Jesus and some core truths, and we're going to get deeper into that in this session, but I wanted to start with this question. Have you ever been disappointed? I want you to picture this. I want you to picture that you have decided to plan a party, a birthday party for one of your friends. And you plan this party and you go all out and you've got it all set up and you know exactly what it's going to be like. And when the party happens, it just doesn't work out the way you thought. Like some people who you thought would come didn't. A whole bunch of people who you didn't think would come showed up. And the guest, the person you had done all this work for, well, wasn't doing what you hoped that they would do at their own party. It was just kind of a mess. I want you to think about a party like that and how you'd feel and how you might react if you had thrown a party and it didn't turn out at all like you thought it would. Hold on to that thought. I'm going to come back to it. So let's talk about the 3 core truths we talked about in session 1. Number 1, Jesus loves you. Number 2, Jesus has a purpose for your life. And number 3, Jesus calls us or wants us to live in relationship with one another. 3 basic kind of core truths I think that we can build the rest of this on. Jesus loves you. Jesus has a purpose for your life. And Jesus calls us to live together in community. Now, I say all that, but also say what I said in session 1. These are things I believe. These are things I believe to be true. I believe that they're true for you. I believe they're true for me. But these are things that I believe, and I'm going to explain to you why I believe them, and also expand on them a little bit in this session. But first, if we're going to talk about this guy Jesus, who loves us and has a purpose for our lives and wants us to live together in relationship, we should talk a little bit more about him. Now, as I said in session 1, the historical question of whether Jesus existed as a person is not really up for much debate. Scholars across different traditions and backgrounds all pretty much say the same thing. Jesus existed. There was some Jewish figure named Jesus in the first century who existed. That's not really the question. But what is the question, and this is what we talked about in session 1, was that there are certain claims that different traditions make about Jesus. And namely, as Christians, we affirm 2 big things. He was the Son of God, that he was raised from the dead on the 3rd day. So those kind of big claims about Jesus. But it's also worth talking about kind of who Jesus was and what he did, okay? Because that just kind of sums up kind of who he was and what he did at the end of his life. But what about his ministry? He spent 3 years, well, he spent 30 plus years on earth, but 3 years of it were an active ministry, and that's what's documented for us in the Gospels. So I want to take a deeper look first at Jesus himself. Now, what should you know about Jesus? Jesus is referred to in the Gospels as a rabbi, okay? Throughout the whole of the Bible, the only spot where the word rabbi is used, I think it's 16 times, I looked it up and I can't remember, it's around 16 times that the word rabbi is used, it refers to Jesus. So Jesus was a rabbi. Well, what does it mean that Jesus was a rabbi? Well, simply put, rabbi means teacher. Jesus was a teacher. And every rabbi, to kind of boil it down, had beliefs that they taught or things that they believed and things that they did. Things that they believed and things that they did. So they had beliefs and practices. And the disciples of a given rabbi, their goal was to learn everything that the rabbi knew, everything that the rabbi taught, everything that the rabbi did, they wanted to do. Okay? Now, to understand that, you've also got to understand how you started following a rabbi. Now, this is not mine. I borrowed this all from a Numa video years ago. I learned from Rob Bell, so I want to give proper credit there. But here's what you have to understand about the first century. In the first century, everybody got basic religious education. But if you were pretty good, if you were one of the best of Jewish boys, particularly Jewish boys, if you were one of the best, you could then go on to a second level of religious education. And if you got through that and you were still one of the best, I mean, so at this point, we had the best through level 1, the best of the best in level 2. If you were the best of the best, you could go and find a rabbi. Now, there were a lot of rabbis in the first century, a lot of Jewish teachers who taught different understandings of what it meant to be faithful to God. That was basically what they were trying to do. And there were a lot of rabbis, but you'd go and you'd find a rabbi and you would ask to follow that rabbi. And the rabbi would quiz them and find out what they knew. And if they thought they had what it took to be their disciple, the rabbi's disciple, they would say, hey, come and follow me, right? So that's how you became a disciple. So we find out that Jesus has disciples, right? So he's living into this model of being a rabbi, of being a first century teacher. He has disciples. But every rabbi kind of had their core teachings, right? So we talk about how their beliefs and practices. Well, Jesus actually sums up very nicely his using this word. He says, "Come to me, all you who are struggling hard and carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest. Put on my yoke," come back to that word, that's why it's in bold, "and learn from me. I'm gentle and humble, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." A yoke? Ever heard of a yoke? That's a yoke. That there is a yoke. A yoke is something that usually you put on livestock, often oxen in this case. And what a yoke does is that it guides you throughout your life, right? So in this case, the yoke is guiding the oxen, right? So the farmer or whoever's operating the plow or whatever uses the yoke, not the oak, the yoke, to guide the livestock. Well, in the same way, the idea of a yoke is that's what guides us in our lives. And what Jesus was saying is, look, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, okay? So Jesus was trying to make the point that compared to other rabbis of the day who had very complicated, very intricate, very hard systems that were to follow, his was relatively easy. Or in our language, we might say another word, and I'll come to that. But let's look at his yoke. Jesus' yoke can be boiled down to three things. He wanted his followers to do three things. That's it, three main things. He said, love God. Love God. Love others. And love yourself. Or specifically, love God, love others, and love others as you love yourself. This was his yoke. This is what he wanted his disciples to know. This is what he wanted his disciples to learn. So that's what he taught. A rabbi's yoke was what you committed yourself to learning, to being, to following, and then to teaching. That's why rabbis got followers, was to expand out their teaching. So we find Jesus recruiting disciples to go out and to love God, love others as they love themselves. That's the core, right? Now, we could spend a lot of time trying to explain what all that means, okay? And we could spend more than a retreat. We could spend more than a whole weekend talking about that. But the simple question that it comes down to is this: what does this mean for us? What does it mean for us to be Jesus' disciples today, right? Because it's not 2,000 years ago. We don't follow Jesus around in a physical way like people did in the first century. So what does it mean for us to follow Jesus? Well, I actually think it's pretty similar. Jesus' command says the same: follow me, right? Jesus still wants disciples. That's what the church has done for over 2,000 years, is they've made disciples. They've made followers of Jesus. And as I said, we could spend a lot of time talking about it, but very simply, to be Jesus' disciple means that you're going to strive to love God, love others, and love others specifically as you love yourself, right? Love God, love others, and love yourself. That's what it means. So when we talk about confirmation, which is what we're supposed to talk about here for the whole thing, what we're saying is that when you say, I want to join the church, I want to be confirmed, which often is connected to join the church, doesn't always have to be, but often is, what we're saying is this: I'm committing to loving God, loving others as I love myself, and doing so as part of a community of people. That's what it means to be a disciple, right? Now remember what Jesus said about his yoke. He said it was easy and the burden was light, okay? Now, in our day and age, the word easy's changed, so I've used this word instead. It's simple, right? It's simple. Love God, love others, love yourself, and do it as part of a community. It's simple, but it's not easy. It's simple, but it's not easy. So remember that party analogy I used earlier, the analogy about planning a party for a friend and then nothing going the way that you thought it would? Well, I want you to think about that and maybe the disappointment you might have felt when things just didn't work out the way you hoped. And I want to introduce you to a guy by the name of John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist is a figure in the Bible. Some of you will be familiar with him. He was actually Jesus' cousin. And his ministry actually began before Jesus'. So we meet John first, and we know that John had some disciples who followed John in the same way that the disciples followed Jesus. In fact, some of John's disciples ended up becoming Jesus' disciples. And John was a fiery, passionate guy. When people came out where he was doing his ministry, he was baptizing people, when people came out who he didn't think highly of. He called them a brood of vipers, right? Now, I don't know, but that doesn't sound like you're trying to make friends with people if you call them a brood of vipers. But this was John. He was fiery, he was passionate. And what the Bible tells us, and Jesus himself says this, that John was preparing the way for Jesus. That John was kind of a forerunner who got people ready, who prepared the way for Jesus. So he was very important in Jesus' ministry. So Jesus comes on the scene and John says things like, well, he must increase and I must decrease. But that doesn't mean John faded away completely. And John got himself in some trouble because the local governor was engaged in some things that John didn't think very highly of. So he objected, very vocally. And being that it was the governor and the governor had a lot of power, he put John in jail. So in the 11th chapter of the book of Matthew, we find out that John is in jail. And he's hearing about what's going on. He's hearing about the ministry of Jesus. And this is where the story picks up and tells us. It says, now when John heard in prison about the things the Christ or Jesus was doing, he sent word by his disciples. So he couldn't go himself. So he sent his disciples asking, are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? Now, when I read this passage, I can't help but think, oh man, John was sitting there in prison, hearing about what was going on and thinking, that's not what I pictured. That's not what I planned. I thought the coming kingdom of God would be a massive judgment on people who were unrighteous and bad people would get what they had coming, and good people would be rewarded. And that's not what's happening. And he had some serious questions. We might even say he had some doubts about whether Jesus was who he thought he was. And therefore he asked the very question, well, wait, are you actually the one who is to come, or should we wait for somebody else? Now, you might expect that Jesus might not handle this well. He might get upset. He might be annoyed that John was questioning him. After all, he should have faith. He should know. He should trust. What's up with this asking of hard questions about who Jesus is? But what we find out is that John's response was to praise. Or Jesus' response was to praise John. He praised him. He gave him the evidence. First he said, okay, look, go back and tell John what you see. He listed off the miracles and signs and how they lined up with the Old Testament. So he answered his question. But he then, in front of a whole crowd of people, began to praise John and praise the ministry that John had done. There was no judgment. There was no anger. There was no rejection. John asked a good question. Jesus gave a good answer and then praised him. Because see, John wasn't asking the question to be a problem. John wasn't asking the question to be a pain. John was asking the question because it was a good question. A lot of people thought that when the Messiah, the deliverer, the Christ, when Jesus came, they had a lot of expectations of what that person was going to do. And Jesus didn't really line up with a lot of those expectations. So it was just a good question that John was asking. And instead of getting judgment or anything like that, Jesus responded by praising John. Hold on to that. Because here's the thing. I want you to hold on to that story of John. You see, John, I think, had it easy, right? He got to see Jesus in person. He got to witness his ministry. He was there when he was baptized. I mean, he had all kinds of advantages. If anybody should have gotten this right, it should have been John, right? But even John had questions. Even John had doubts, okay? And I think it comes to this question. Why, if this is so simple, love God, love others as you love yourself, why, if that is so simple, why isn't it easy? Why is this faith thing hard sometimes? Why is it hard to kind of wrap our mind around? Well, I think there's a couple reasons for that. And I think there's kind of two I want to highlight. One is some of the things that we as Christians believe and declare, I admit, are a little out there. Okay? The idea that there's a God who created the entire world and that God came down on earth and walked around as a human, that's an interesting belief. And the other one, that Jesus came back from the dead on the third day after being like really dead. He didn't fake his death. That he was really dead and came back. Like, those are both pretty serious beliefs that if you struggle with, you have questions with, to be honest with you, I don't blame you. So maybe that's some of you. But I think for others of you, if you struggle to believe in God and this idea of faith, I want to kind of throw out 4 reasons why I think that might be true for you. Let's try these out. Some of you may say, well, can science and faith go together? Do we need to pick? Because there's a lot of people out there, both Christians and non-Christians, who would tell you that you can't be serious about your science and you can't be serious about your faith. That's a good question. It's a very good question. It's a question I have a lot of opinions about because my background is actually in science, but I'll spare you that whole talk. But that's a good question. Can science and faith go together? What about evolution? What about the first chapters of Genesis? Those are good questions to be asking. Maybe, though, that's not your question. Maybe this is your question. How can an all-good and all-loving God create a world like ours? In the midst of everything we see on TV and in the midst of the news of disease and starvation and hunger and violence and injustice, of everything that's wrong with the world, how can we believe that an all-good and all-loving God created this? That doesn't make sense. That's a good question. Or maybe it's this. It's very personal for you. If God is real and God loves me, why is my life the way it is? I've had people say this to me. Brian, I understand why you can believe in God, but my life is a mess. If there is a God, then that God is not good. Or there's no God. Because if God were good and God were all loving, my life would not be the way it is. I've had people say that to my face. You know what? That's a good question. That's a good thing to wrestle with. And last but not least, some parts of the Bible just don't make a whole lot of sense. You know, if you're sitting there and you think about the story of Noah, this massive worldwide flood, big boat, animals, and you go, that's really weird. I don't know what to make of that. That's a really good question. That's a really good question to be asking. So those are kind of 4, right? And those questions may not be your questions. You may have other questions. You probably do have questions. But those are kind of 4 that I've heard and that even I thought of. And I thought it might be helpful before we go further to tell you a little bit about my story and why I'm where I am now and what I kind of come to believe about this and why it's been so important to me. So I think I mentioned it in session 1. I grew up a church kid. My parents went to church every Sunday. It was something that we did. I actually enjoyed going to church most of the time. Sometimes I really did wish we could be like other families that didn't go to church and just stay home on Sundays. But most of the time, I didn't mind going to church. It was okay. So I grew up going to church. I went through confirmation. I think in 8th grade. Was confirmed and didn't love confirmation, but it was novel. I mean, I learned some stuff. But right about 16, a little older than probably most of you, but not too far away, a little older than 16, things just stopped making sense. I don't know how to explain it on that. Things just stopped making sense. And I think for me it was the fact that just some of these things I was asked to believe, right? I kind of talked about like Jesus, the Son of God, God coming to earth, taking on human flesh, that kind of stuff, coming back from the dead. I really struggled with some of those things. I didn't know what to make of them. And all of a sudden, when I was 16, like things just began to change for me. They just stopped making sense. That's literally all I can say is that things just stopped making sense for me. So I didn't know what to do. I didn't really want to talk to anybody about this. To me, it felt kind of embarrassing that I just didn't want to talk about the fact that my faith that I thought was fairly strong, I thought was fairly good, seems to be crumbling around me. And I remember one night, it was spring of my junior year, so at that point I was 17 years old. Things had gone from like bad to worse. My grandfather had passed away. Things just weren't really good. And I remember I laid down in bed one night and I was like face down, staring into my pillow. And I remember praying out loud the following prayer: God, I know you're not real, but if you are. And I stopped. I didn't even pray beyond that. I just said, God, I know you're not real, but if you are. And I just stopped. And I can't explain why I stopped. I can't explain what I felt in that moment. But all of a sudden, I just felt free. I felt like even though silently, I just admitted it to myself. I didn't even told anybody else. I told the pillow. That's it. Just a pillow. I just told myself, look, I had said it out loud that I didn't know if God existed, but if God did. And all I can tell you is that changed everything. It didn't get better all at once. It didn't suddenly get better. It wasn't like I woke up the next day and was like, oh, I believe again. Great, perfect. That's not what happened at all. But something changed in that moment. For me, The turning point in my story was when I finally decided to admit my own doubts and questions. That was what kind of set me free when I would even admit it to myself. Suddenly, when I felt like I had the freedom to ask the questions I wanted to ask and to say the things that I needed to say, and I could say them out loud, suddenly I began to put the pieces of my faith back together. Again, it didn't happen fast. The faith that I had kind of walked away from when I was younger to the faith that I put together after that was very different, and it needed to be. I'm going to explain why here in a minute. But that was the point. That was the turning point. You know, we tend to talk about these things like faith, doubt, and belief. And what a lot of people seem to say is, well, you either have faith or you doubt. And what I want to say is that, no, that's not true. Faith is different than doubt and belief, right? You can believe something and you can doubt something. Those are opposites. It's not faith versus doubt. It's doubt versus belief. And here's the thing. Some people talk about faith like you've got to have it all together. That if you have faith, that if you're a Christian, you just believe everything. You got it all together. You've got all your questions answered. You know all the things. You don't have any doubts anymore. And that's when you're ready to take the step of faith. And, you know, when I think about that, I look at the disciples and I think that's not true. The Bible is full of people who ask a lot of questions. Now, sometimes Jesus gets frustrated, all right? Jesus gets frustrated primarily with his disciples, who just don't seem to be listening as well as they should, and with religious authorities who are out to get him. But more often than not, we see Jesus engaging in good conversation with people. That when they're asked questions, he engages them. Over and over, it can be disciples. There's a guy by the name of the rich young ruler who comes to him and asks questions. There's a guy by the name of Nicodemus who comes to ask him questions. People come to Jesus and they ask him questions because they have questions and they have doubts. And Jesus doesn't say, leave. Don't come follow me until you've got all your questions answered. Jesus didn't ask the disciples, do you have it all figured out? And then say, come and follow me. He said, come and follow me. And along the way, ask your questions and we'll figure things out together. We have this phrase in the Christian tradition that I've come to value so much. It says, faith seeking understanding. A lot of people think that you understand in order to have faith. But faith seeking understanding says is, no. You embrace faith and then you seek to understand. That it's through committing in faith and saying, yes, I believe in God. I believe those core truths. I believe that Jesus came back from the dead. I believe these things, even if I have serious questions about them. You see, faith means believing and having doubts at the same time. Having faith is being able to believe things and have those questions and doubts, and together say, yes, I have a lot of hard, good questions, and these are things I know I believe, and I'm going to work together with other people around me to figure out what those things mean. It's not about faith versus doubt. Faith is what allows us to live a life of faith, even in spite of our doubts and our questions. You know, I want to kind of draw you into another example, and that's about science. So as I said, my background's actually in science. I was a physics major in college. And I loved it. I loved it, by the way. And one of the things about science that's so cool when we look at the world is when we think we have something figured out and we make a discovery, we find out that there's a whole lot of stuff now that we don't know. What seems to happen more and more in science is the more we know, the more what we know is how little we actually do know. And let me talk about, for example, the atom, right? Most of you know that an atom is kind of the smallest particle of matter, right? But when we started researching atoms, what we found out is that atoms actually are made up of neutrons, protons, and electrons. But we then did some more research and find out that electrons aren't particles in the same way that we kind of thought they were. So you see, we thought we had atoms, then we figured out we had neutrons, protons, and electrons. But then we even figured out that those aren't necessarily particles in the same way, especially electrons that we thought. And then we did more research and we found out that then there's subatomic particles like quarks and stuff like that. So my point is this, the more we learned about atoms, the more we learned how little we actually knew. In other words, the more we learned, the more we realized how much more we had to learn. And see, that's what I think faith is. Faith isn't about learning everything you can so you can believe. It's about believing so you can learn more about faith and about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. That's what I love about faith. That's where, for me, faith and science come together so well. Is that for me, they're both about committing to something to learn more and to gain more understanding. So many people that I know so desperately want to believe. They so desperately want to believe, but their doubts and their questions, they hold them back. And they say, I can't. I can't believe until I have all my questions answered. And what I want to say is, you know what? That's not it. That's not it. It's not about getting all your questions answered. It's about embracing faith. And we're going to talk more about what it means to embrace faith. I realize I've used that a couple times and haven't really explained what I mean. But it's about embracing faith and then sorting through those questions. I heard a quote a few years ago that I want to share with you to kind of close this out. Because on the one hand, this is so simple, right? It's so simple. Love God, love others as you love yourself. It's so simple. And yet it's not easy. It's not easy because some of the things we're asked to believe are hard. There's our own human experiences. There's what our gut instincts tell us. There's a lot. It's not easy. But it is simple. But a quote I heard a few years ago that's really kind of impacted me is this. It says, doubt isn't toxic to faith. If you're sitting there listening to this and you say, Brian, I've got so many questions about this and this and this, and some of them are about the Bible, and some about the idea of God in general, and some about my life and my friends and my family. I've got so many questions, but I'm afraid to say them out loud because what if it makes me a bad person? And what I want to say is this: doubt isn't toxic to faith, but unexpressed doubt is. And if you remember my story, what almost killed my faith was not being willing to express the doubt and questions that I was sitting with. It was not being willing to say them out loud. It was not daring to say what I was feeling inside. So as we get ready to move toward our next session where we're going to talk about the sacraments, I want you to think very, very, very carefully about this. What are the questions you have on your heart? What are the things in your mind, in your gut instinct, that are just tearing at you and holding you back? And saying, yeah, I kind of get this God thing and this church thing, but I don't know about this. What are those? And I want you to think about those. And I want you to really seriously think and pray. And I want you to share them with your leaders. Because I've come to believe this is absolutely 100% true. Doubt isn't toxic to faith. Your questions and your doubts do not have to kill your faith. But if you don't feel comfortable sharing them, if you don't find ways to verbalize them and to tell people and to talk about them, they may become toxic to your faith. So as you wrap up this session, that's where I want to leave you. Jesus calls us to follow him. He says, look, come, follow me, be my disciples, love God, love others as you love yourself. It's so simple, but it's not easy. And it's not easy because some of the stuff that we wrestle with, some of the things we see are hard. And it's okay. And I don't want you to be afraid of those things. I don't want you to be afraid of the doubt, afraid of the questions, afraid of the things that have come up in your mind. I'll close with a story. A few years ago, I had a girl at a confirmation retreat. And she was kind of a mess, I'm not going to lie. And she said to me, at one point, prior to the retreat, she said, you know what, Brian, I had this whole faith thing figured out. She was in 7th grade when this happened. I had this whole faith thing figured out, Brian. If you had come to me 2 years ago, I could have given you all the right answers, Brian, to all the questions that I have. But you know what, Brian? I don't know. In 2 years, something's happened. She went from 5th grade to 7th grade. Suddenly, all kinds of things in her life that made sense stopped making sense. It stopped working in the same way. And she said, I just don't know what to do. And I asked her for some of the questions. And you know what? She had some really good questions. And at the end of that talk, I said to her, you know what? We're not going to answer and solve all these questions tonight. But I just am so excited you're asking those questions. They're such great questions. And I can't wait to explore those questions with you. Fast forward a year. We're at the confirmation retreat. Same girl, same situation. And she's sitting there and she's so stressed out. She's stressed out all weekend. And finally, Saturday night, we're sitting around. We're working on our statements of faith. And she hands me her statement of faith. And she's smiling. And she says, in the opening line of her statement of faith, says something like this. When I started confirmation, I was so terrified to write my statement of faith because I thought once I say, this is what I believe, this is what I'm believing for the rest of my life. But now I know that's not true. I know that my faith will change. I know the things that I believe now will not be the things that I believe in a few years. So this is what I believe today. I love that story. Because it's about somebody who's willing to be honest about their questions and honest about their doubts, who is willing to verbalize them, and then realize this, that right now you're at one step on the journey. You're one step on a journey of life where you're going to experience new things. That's going to change what you believe. You're going to learn new things. That's going to change what you believe. And the things that you right now, the things that you believe this day, this instant, you're not going to believe those things in the same way that you do in 3 or 5, 7, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Because you're going to learn new things. You're going to experience new things. You know what? That's good. We see that in the disciples. The things that they struggled with and believed at the beginning weren't the same things that they struggled with at the end. And by the end of their lives, when they had been preaching Jesus' message for years, it had changed again. So today you're being asked to say, this is what I believe today. This is what I believe now. And I think the most important thing is for those of you who are struggling with hard, good questions, is I want you to know that this is simple, but it is not easy. Your questions, your doubts, whatever you want to call them, are fair. They're good. And in learning to say those things out loud and learning to ask those tough questions, I think for so many of you, that will be what unlocks new understandings in faith. That idea of faith, seeking understanding, that we believe, that we place our faith in Jesus in order to better understand. Blessings. Ask those hard questions, because this is simple, but it is not easy. Ask your hard questions and know that Jesus is ready to embrace those, just as he embraced John's.